The Korean War and the failure of unification. The division of the Korean Peninsula in 1945 marked the beginning of a protracted struggle for unification that would culminate in the Korean War, one of the most devastating conflicts of the 20th century. In June 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, launched a full-scale invasion of the South, seeking to reunify the peninsula under its communist leadership. The United States, viewing the conflict as a threat to the global balance of power, intervened on behalf of the Republic of South Korea, sending troops under the banner of the United Nations Command. This intervention transformed the Korean War into a proxy conflict of the Cold War, with both superpowers vying for influence in Asia. The war quickly escalated into a brutal and chaotic battle, marked by significant territorial gains and losses for both sides. The North Korean People's Army initially overwhelmed the South Korean forces, pushing them to the brink of annihilation at the Pusan perimeter, a critical defensive bulge in the southeast corner of the peninsula. However, the tide turned dramatically in September 1950 when General Douglas MacArthur executed a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, breaking the North's advance and reversing the momentum of the war. The subsequent war of attrition and shifting front lines led to extensive civilian and military casualties, with the war ultimately reaching a stalemate. In July 1953, an armistice was signed at the Korean Demilitarized Zone, halting active hostilities but failing to achieve lasting unification. The armistice, rather than a peace treaty, left the division of the peninsula in place, with the Demilitarized Zone serving as a militarized buffer zone. While the Korean War did not result in the reunification of Korea, it entrenched the division along ideological and political lines, laying the groundwork for the deepening enmity between the two Koreas in the subsequent decades. The war's legacy of violence and unresolved tensions would shape the trajectory of inter-Korean relations for generations, setting the stage for the complex dynamics of the Cold War era. The stalemate and the birth of a divided Korea. The 1953 Korean War armistice marked a definitive turning point in the history of the Korean Peninsula, though it also raised profound questions about the future of the divided nation. The armistice agreement, signed by representatives of North Korea, the Republic of Korea, the United Nations Command led by the US and China, was a stopgap measure designed to end immediate hostilities rather than a permanent solution to the conflict. In the document, the signatories agreed to an exchange of prisoners of war and the establishment of the Korean Demilitarized Zone, a 250-kilometer-wide buffer zone stretching along the 38th parallel, where the armistice forces would be deployed. Despite halting the fighting, the agreement did not resolve the issue of Korean unification, leaving the peninsula split along the same ideological and territorial line that had existed at the onset of the war. This unresolved division carried with it deep and lasting consequences for both Koreas, including heightened militarization, economic impoverishment, and the entrenchment of mutual animosity. The immediate aftermath of the armistice saw the two Koreas become entrenched in separate geopolitical systems. The North, aligned firmly with the Soviet-led communist bloc, embarked on a path of self-reliance under the Juche ideology, a system of thought that emphasized Korean independence through military and economic self-sufficiency. In contrast, the South, supported by the United States and its allies, began a more delicate balancing act of navigating Cold War alliances while pursuing its own path to recovery and development. This divergence was compounded by the political and social realities on the ground. The war had left both sides with staggering human and material losses, with estimates of 2 to 3 million North Korean casualties and over 33,000 US and South Korean soldiers killed. Civilian populations in both Koreas bore the brunt of the conflict as well, suffering from widespread destruction, forced relocations, and the collapse of social infrastructure. The failure to draft a peace treaty after the armistice further complicated the situation. Instead of negotiating terms for lasting peace, the warring parties accepted the status quo, with each claiming that the armistice left the door open for future reunification. However, the mutual distrust and ideological barriers between the Koreas made such a proposition difficult to realize in practice. The absence of a formal peace agreement allowed for the continued presence of foreign troops, particularly U.S. forces in the South, which were tasked with maintaining deterrence against any renewed aggression from the North. This militarized stalemate not only reinforced the division of the peninsula but also laid the groundwork for a long-standing pattern of conflict and confrontation in the subsequent decades. Therefore, the Korean War did not merely halt the possibility of unification for a time. It reshaped the course of Korean history in ways that would echo throughout the Cold War era and beyond. The legacy of the armistice, the entrenched division along the demilitarized zone, and the unresolved question of peace would become defining features of inter-Korean relations, influencing political, military, and diplomatic developments for decades to come. This deep-seated division would not only remain a source of regional instability in East Asia but also serve as a symbol of the broader Cold War struggle between the capitalist and communist worlds. As the world moved into the next chapter of the 20th century, the Korean Peninsula stood as a battleground of competing ideologies, with the promise of unification fading further into the horizon. Cold War tensions and the deepening divide. As the 20th century progressed, the Korean Peninsula became a focal point of Cold War tensions, with both the United States and the Soviet Union vying for influence in the region. North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, aligned itself with the Soviet Union and China, forming a strategic alliance that provided economic, military, and ideological support. This alliance deepened the ideological divide between North and South Korea, with North Korea positioning itself as a stronghold of communism and social equality. In contrast, South Korea, led by Syngman Rhee and later Park Chung-hee, found itself increasingly dependent on U.S. support to maintain stability and counter the perceived threat from the North. The presence of U.S. military forces in South Korea, particularly the 3rd Infantry Division that arrived in 1953, became a symbol of America's commitment to containing communism in the region and deterring North Korean aggression. The Cold War dynamics of the period were marked by a series of political and military standoffs, with both Koreas engaging in a cycle of threat and counter-threat that further entrenched their division. North Korea, bolstered by its alliances with the Soviet Union and China, periodically tested its military capabilities, including missile and nuclear programs, while the South received continuous economic and military assistance from the U.S. to strengthen its defenses. The U.S. also played a direct role in South Korea's political landscape, ensuring that its governments remained aligned with American interests. For instance, the U.S. backed Park Chung-hee's authoritarian regime in the 1960s and 1970s, which pursued rapid industrialization and economic modernization as a counter to North Korea's communist ideology. This economic divergence further widened the gap between the two Koreas, with the South transitioning into a semi-industrialized economy by the 1970s, while the North remained isolated and heavily reliant on external support. Cultural and ideological differences also deepened the divide between the two Koreas. North Korea adopted the Juche ideology, a state-centric philosophy that emphasized self-reliance and the rejection of foreign influence. This framework supported the North's narrative of itself as a bastion of resistance against imperialism and a champion of Korean sovereignty. Conversely, South Korea embraced a more liberal and Western-oriented cultural identity, shaped by decades of U.S. military and economic presence. The two Koreas presented starkly different images of Korean identity to the world. The North portrayed itself as a unified, self-sufficient nation led by the Kim family dynasty, while the South emphasized its democratic institutions, economic dynamism, and cultural innovation. These contrasting narratives not only reinforced ideological divisions, but also hindered any meaningful dialogue between the two Koreas. The Cold War also brought moments of inter-Korean engagement, though these were often fraught with tension and mistrust. For example, North Korea occasionally proposed dialogue or cooperation initiatives, such as the 1972 North-South Joint Communique, but these efforts were frequently undermined by political rivalries and external pressures. The U.S. often viewed any significant rapprochement between the two Koreas as a challenge to its regional dominance and imposed conditions to prevent moves toward unification that did not align with its Cold War strategy. Meanwhile, China and the Soviet Union used their influence to ensure that North Korea remained subordinate to their strategic interests, limiting its autonomy in pursuing inter-Korean relations. By the 1980s, the division of the Korean Peninsula had become a deeply institutionalized reality, with both Koreas entrenched in their respective Cold War narratives. The North continued to develop its military-first, sun-gun policy, emphasizing the importance of the armed forces in maintaining its regime and resisting external threats. The South, for its part, became a rising economic power, with the Miracle on the Han River propelling it into the ranks of the world's most dynamic economies. However, these developments did little to bridge the ideological and military gap between the two Koreas. Instead, they reinforced a status quo that prioritized stability and containment over the possibility of reunification. The Cold War thus left the Korean Peninsula in a state of perpetual tension, with the division of the two Koreas becoming as much a part of the regional order as the geopolitical rivalries that underpinned it. Shifts in the post-Cold War era and inter-country rapprochement. The end of the Cold War in the late 1980s and early 1990s marked a significant turning point in the dynamics of North and South Korea's relationship, as global geopolitical tensions eased and new opportunities for inter-Korean dialogue emerged. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which had long been a key geopolitical ally of North Korea, deprived the regime of a crucial pillar of its international influence and support. This shift forced North Korea to recalibrate its foreign policy, leading to a gradual but notable openness in its interactions with the outside world, including South Korea. China, which had grown increasingly influential in the region, became North Korea's primary economic and political backer, and its diplomatic stance significantly shaped the North's approach to inter-Korean relations. As China pursued economic liberalization under Deng Xiaoping's reforms, it also urged North Korea to adopt more pragmatic policies to survive in a rapidly changing global landscape. This geopolitical realignment influenced North Korea's strategy, leading to periodic overtures toward reconciliation with the South. One of the most significant developments in this period was the 1991 Inter-Korean Declaration of States, in which both North and South Korea formally recognized each other as sovereign entities. This declaration, though not a step toward unification, signaled a willingness to acknowledge one another's existence and laid the groundwork for future diplomatic engagement. However, true progress in inter-Korean relations remained elusive due to continued political distrust and the unresolved issue of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Despite the 1953 Armistice Agreement, no official peace treaty had yet been signed, leaving the division in a state of legal ambiguity and military tension. This situation began to shift in the late 1990s when both Koreas took steps toward reconciliation, driven in part by the rising influence of China and the broader trend of international economic integration. The turn of the 21st century saw a series of high-profile inter-Korean summits, most notably the historic 2000 and 2007 meetings between North Korean leader Kim Jong-il and South Korean President Kim Young-sar. These summits, facilitated in part by diplomatic efforts from both governments and international actors, marked a new era of dialogue and cooperation. The 2000 summit in Pyongyang and the 2007 summit in Seoul led to significant agreements on economic cooperation, the establishment of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, and a commitment to reducing military tensions. These developments were met with cautious optimism, as they signaled a potential path toward reconciliation. However, these efforts were soon met with setbacks, particularly with North Korea's decision to conduct its first nuclear test in 2006 and subsequent missile launches, which rekindled international tensions and cast doubt on the sustainability of the inter-Korean rapprochement. The complexities of post-Cold War inter-Korean relations highlight the deep-rooted challenges in achieving unity. While political leaders on both sides made symbolic gestures of goodwill, broader structural obstacles, such as ideological differences, military posturing, and economic disparities, continued to hinder meaningful progress. Nevertheless, the thawing of relations in the 1990s and early 2000s demonstrated that the possibility of reconciliation was not entirely out of reach, setting the stage for broader efforts in the future, including those led by figures such as Reverend Sun Myung-moon, who played a unique and influential role in advocating for Korean reunification. Reverend Sun Myung-moon and the Vision for Korean Unity. Reverend Sun Myung-moon, founder of the Unification Church, was deeply influenced by the historical and cultural context of the Korean Peninsula, particularly the trauma and division caused by the Korean War. Born in 1920 in a small rural village in North Jeolla Province, Moon grew up in a time when Korea was under Japanese colonial rule, an experience that shaped his views on national sovereignty and the importance of unification. As a young man, he was profoundly affected by the Korean War, which devastated both North and South Korea and exacerbated the country's division. These experiences instilled in him a strong sense of responsibility to bring about reconciliation between the two Koreas and to preserve the Korean cultural and spiritual identity that had been disrupted by colonization and war. Moon's early life thus became a foundation for his later efforts to advocate for a unified Korea, not just politically but also spiritually and culturally. Moon's aspirations for a united Korea were not born in isolation. They were influenced by broader geopolitical and ideological currents in the 1950s and 1960s. This period saw the consolidation of two separate Korean states, each aligned with opposing Cold War blocs, and the Korean Peninsula remained a highly militarized and tense region. The U.S. military presence in South Korea and the Soviet-Chinese alliance with North Korea further entrenched the division, making the possibility of reunification seem distant. Against this backdrop, Moon's vision of a unified Korea was not only a political goal but a moral crusade, rooted in his belief that the Korean people, as a single ethnic and cultural group, had the right to self-determination and harmony. He viewed the division of the peninsula as a moral injustice and an affront to the collective identity of Koreans, regardless of their ideological affiliations. In the 1950s and 1960s, Moon began to lay the groundwork for his unification dream by integrating Korean nationalism into the spiritual framework of the Unification Church, which he founded in 1954. The church, initially a small religious movement with few followers, gained momentum under Moon's impassioned leadership and his vision of a Korean-led world peace movement. He emphasized the importance of restoring Korea's cultural heritage and creating a new Korean identity that could transcend the divisions of the Cold War era. This vision also resonated with a growing diaspora of Koreans outside the peninsula, many of whom carried the shared memory of a unified Korea before the division. Moon's early efforts, though nascent, were driven by a clear understanding that unifying the Korean people would require more than just political negotiations. It would necessitate a cultural, spiritual, and ideological reinvigoration of the Korean identity. By the 1970s, Moon's ideas had evolved into a broader, more organized movement, as he sought to rally international support for Korean unification and to establish a model for sustainable peace. His unique blend of Korean nationalism, Christian theology, and utopian idealism would later become instrumental in his engagement with inter-Korean relations during the Cold War and beyond. Advocacy for Korean reunification, founding the Universal Peace Federation and the Tongsunmun. By the 1970s, Reverend Sun Myung-moon had firmly established himself as a global advocate for peace and unification, leveraging his growing influence to promote Korean reunification as a central tenet of his work. At the heart of this effort was his founding of the Universal Peace Federation, UPF, a worldwide organization dedicated to fostering interfaith dialogue, conflict resolution, and the promotion of cultural and religious harmony. The UPF became instrumental in advancing the goal of Korean reunification by connecting religious and community leaders from diverse backgrounds to advocate for a unified Korean identity. Moon believed that the division of Korea was not merely a political or military issue, but a moral and spiritual challenge that required the collective effort of the global community to address. Through the UPF, he sought to create a platform for dialogue and collaboration among nations, religions, and individuals to facilitate the eventual reunification of Korea in a spirit of mutual respect and shared destiny. A pivotal moment in Moon's advocacy for Korean reunification came in 1971 with the publication of the Tongsamun, or Message for Korean Reunification. This letter, also known as the Unification Message, was addressed to Korean leaders on both sides of the divided peninsula and carried the endorsement of prominent religious and cultural figures from around the world. The Tongsamun called for an end to the division of Korea and proposed a framework for inter-Korean cooperation that emphasized shared cultural heritage, economic integration, and religious harmony. Moon framed the reunification of Korea as a moral imperative and a divine mission, aligning it with his vision of global peace. He urged North and South Korea to set aside ideological differences and work toward a unified nation that could serve as a model of reconciliation and coexistence for the rest of the world. To make the Tongsamun more than a symbolic gesture, Moon mobilized a broad coalition of religious and cultural leaders to support the initiative. This effort included prominent Christian denominations, Buddhist and Shinto religious groups, and even Muslim and Jewish communities in Korea and beyond. By involving a diverse array of voices, Moon sought to demonstrate that the unification of Korea was not a partisan or ideological issue but a universal cause that transcended the boundaries of national and religious identity. The Tongsamun and its accompanying coalition received significant attention, particularly in the Korean diaspora and among international media circles. It served as a powerful message of hope for those like Moon, who believed in the importance of Korean unity as a cornerstone of both regional and global peace. Moon's work on Korean reunification also emphasized the importance of cultural and spiritual cooperation as a precursor to political and economic integration. He often spoke about the shared heritage of the Korean people, highlighting the common traditions, language, and history that united North and South Korea despite their political divisions. His vision of a unified Korea was one that would embrace both modernization and traditional values, ensuring that the cultural identity of the Korean people remained intact even as the nation evolved toward a new future. This approach resonated with many Koreans, who saw in Moon's advocacy a meaningful alternative to the Cold War-era division that had dominated their lives for decades. By framing Korean reunification as a moral and spiritual endeavor, Moon managed to gain support from a wide range of religious and community organizations, both within Korea and internationally. His efforts to bridge the cultural and ideological divides between North and South Korea laid the groundwork for future diplomatic initiatives and contributed to the broader discourse on inter-Korean relations during the Cold War and beyond. Through the Tongsamun and the Universal Peace Federation, Moon not only brought international attention to the issue of Korean unification but also provided a vision that sought to address the deeper, long-standing wounds of division with a message of hope, reconciliation, and shared destiny. Reverend Moon's role in inter-Korean rapprochement and reunification diplomacy. Reverend Sun Myung Moon's influence on Korean history extended beyond his religious and spiritual leadership. He became a significant figure in shaping inter-Korean relations during the 1970s and 1980s, a period marked by heightened Cold War tensions and occasional diplomatic breakthroughs. One of the most notable instances of his engagement with inter-Korean diplomacy occurred in 1971, when he submitted a proposal for Korean reunification to the South Korean government. The Tongsumin, as previously discussed, was intended to serve as a catalyst for dialogue between the two Koreas. However, the South Korean government, led by President Park Chung-hee at the time, chose not to respond publicly, wary of Moon's growing influence and the potential repercussions of engaging in high-profile conversations with North Korea. Despite this, the Tongsumin gained international recognition, and its message of Korean unity resonated with many South Koreans and members of the global Korean diaspora. Although the Tongsumin was not officially adopted by the South Korean government, it laid the groundwork for future diplomatic overtures. In 1972, the North and South issued the North-South Joint Communique, a significant, if limited, step toward inter-Korean dialogue. While the communique did not mark a sudden shift in relations, it was widely seen as a compromise that reflected the broader efforts of various actors, including Reverend Moon, to encourage peaceful engagement. The North-South Joint Communique set the tone for future discussions, emphasizing peaceful reunification and cooperation, which aligned closely with Moon's advocacy. His continued efforts helped reinforce an environment in which dialogue between the two Koreas, however constrained, remained possible. Another pivotal moment in Moon's involvement in inter-Korean negotiations took place in 1989 with his proposal for a Seoul summit, aimed at fostering high-level dialogue between North and South Korean leaders. The idea was to create a framework for peaceful reunification that would involve not only political leaders but also cultural, economic, and religious institutions. Moon's plan envisioned a summit in which both sides could discuss a shared vision for Korea's future, guided by principles of mutual respect and cooperation. While the Seoul summit did not materialize at the time, Moon's proposal had a lasting impact, serving as a blueprint for future inter-Korean summits, including the 2000 and 2007 summits between North Korean leader Kim Jong-il and South Korean presidents Kim Young-sa and Roh Moo-hyun, respectively. The 2000 summit, in particular, was directly influenced by the groundwork laid by Moon and other advocates of Korean unity, as it marked the first high-level meeting between North and South leaders since the end of the Korean War. In addition to proposing diplomatic initiatives, Reverend Moon played a role in fostering people-to-people exchanges between the two Koreas. He believed that cultural and religious unity could pave the way for political reconciliation, and thus he actively encouraged inter-Korean cooperation in religious and educational spheres. Through the Universal Peace Federation and other organizations he founded, Moon facilitated dialogues between religious leaders, scholars, and community figures from both Koreas. These interactions, often overlooked in official diplomatic records, contributed to the gradual normalization of relations between the two Koreas by building mutual understanding and trust among Korean citizens. Reverend Moon's advocacy and efforts, while not always immediately successful, were instrumental in shaping the broader discourse on inter-Korean relations. His vision of a unified Korea, rooted in shared cultural and religious values, provided an alternative perspective to the rigid Cold War narratives of the time. By engaging in dialogue and promoting inter-Korean cooperation, Moon helped create the conditions for the diplomatic breakthroughs that would emerge in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. His contributions, though often dismissed by political leaders, were crucial in fostering an environment in which peace and unification could be seriously considered as tangible possibilities on the Korean peninsula. Challenges and criticisms of Reverend Moon's reunification efforts. Despite Reverend Sun Myung Moon's tireless advocacy for Korean reunification, his efforts were not without significant challenges and criticisms. One of the most prominent obstacles was the deep-seated ideological divide between North and South Korea, which made Moon's vision of a unified Korea seem at times overly idealistic or impractical. North Korea, under the rigid Juche ideology, perceived Moon's initiatives as a threat to its sovereignty and self-reliance. The North Korean regime, controlled tightly by the Kim family dynasty, emphasized the importance of maintaining its own separate identity and resisted any external influences, including those from religious movements in the South. This made collaboration between Moon's organizations and North Korean authorities particularly difficult, as the regime was wary of the growing influence of religious and cultural initiatives from the South. Similarly, South Korean political leaders were often reluctant to fully endorse Moon's efforts. While some of his initiatives resonated with public sentiment, the South Korean government, especially during the Cold War, was acutely aware of the risks of associating with a religious leader whose movement was regarded with suspicion by both the North and the international community. Moon's growing influence in South Korea, often attributed to the loyalty of his followers and the charisma of his advocacy, was seen by some as a potential threat to the secular, nationalist order of the state. This led to a complex relationship between Moon and the South's political establishment, with some leaders attempting to navigate his ideas while downplaying his role in inter-Korean affairs. The South's Cold War alignment with the United States further complicated Moon's efforts, as many of his proposals were viewed with skepticism by American policymakers who were primarily focused on containing North Korea's nuclear ambitions rather than promoting a broader unification agenda. In addition to political resistance, Reverend Moon's efforts faced internal challenges within his own movement. The Unification Church, while deeply committed to the ideal of Korean unity, often struggled to translate this vision into practical inter-Korean cooperation. The organization's focus on religious and cultural initiatives, while valuable in fostering cross-border dialogue, sometimes overshadowed the political and economic realities that would be necessary for actual unification. Moon's insistence on a moral and divine framework for reunification occasionally led to friction with more pragmatic political leaders and diplomats in both North and South Korea. Moreover, the global perception of the Unification Church as a controversial or even eccentric movement further undermined its credibility in formal diplomatic circles. This external skepticism, combined with the deep political divides on the Korean peninsula, made Moon's goal of Korean unification a difficult one to realize through conventional diplomatic channels. Another significant challenge facing Moon's vision was the personal and logistical obstacles he encountered in the 1980s. In 1986, a bitter family conflict within his organization led to a dramatic and public split, with many of his followers in the South questioning his leadership and vision. This internal turmoil weakened the Unification Church's ability to project a unified message at a time when inter-Korean relations were once again becoming volatile. Additionally, during the 1980s and 1990s, North Korea's increasing isolation and military-first policy further complicated any efforts toward reconciliation. As Pyongyang prioritized self-reliance and military strength, Moon's proposals for cultural and religious cooperation were seen by the North as a distraction from its strategic interests. Despite these challenges, Reverend Moon's efforts were not in vain. His ideas and initiatives, though often met with skepticism, played a crucial role in shaping the broader discourse on Korean unification. By engaging with religious and cultural leaders from around the world, he was able to maintain a dialogue on the importance of Korean identity and the eventual reunification of the peninsula. His work also helped to lay the groundwork for later diplomatic efforts, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s when inter-Korean relations began to thaw. The challenges he faced, whether political, ideological, or internal, ultimately reinforced the complexity of the unification issue and highlighted the need for a multifaceted approach that combined political diplomacy, cultural cooperation, and grassroots engagement. Reverend Moon's unification model, a spiritual and cultural foundation for Korean unity. Reverend Sun Myung Moon's vision for Korean unification was not merely political. It also encompassed a comprehensive model integrating spiritual, cultural, and educational dimensions to create a foundation for lasting reunification. Central to his philosophy was the belief that true unity could only be achieved if the Korean people on both sides of the DMZ shared a common cultural and religious identity, one that transcended the divisions imposed by colonialism, war, and Cold War geopolitics. Moon envisioned a unified Korea grounded in the spiritual values of the Unification Church, the shared cultural heritage of the Korean people, and a commitment to global peace and cooperation. This holistic approach distinguished his efforts from conventional diplomatic strategies, which often focused solely on political negotiations and security concerns. At the heart of Moon's model was the concept of a new Korea, a visionary society that would be a synthesis of both traditional Korean values and modern democratic principles. He emphasized the importance of restoring and preserving Korean cultural traditions, including language, folk customs, and religious heritage, as a means of fostering national identity. He also believed in the need for a new political and economic system that would reject the autocratic and militaristic policies of both North and South Korea and instead promote democratic governance, economic cooperation, and cultural harmony. Moon's vision of the new Korea was not one that would impose a single ideological framework, but rather one that would integrate the best aspects of both Koreas, respecting the social welfare policies and strong national identity of the North while embracing the economic dynamism and democratic institutions of the South. Beyond politics and culture, Moon's unification model also had a strong religious and spiritual dimension. He viewed the division of the Korean peninsula as a moral and spiritual crisis, believing that true reconciliation required not only political solutions but also a spiritual awakening among the Korean people. The Unification Church, as a global religious movement, served as a vehicle for this spiritual transformation. Moon encouraged interfaith dialogue among religious communities in both North and South Korea, believing that shared religious values could bridge the ideological divide between the two Koreas. He also promoted the idea of a Korean-led world peace movement, in which the unification of Korea would serve as a model for resolving conflicts and fostering cooperation on a global scale. Through the Universal Peace Federation and other initiatives, Moon sought to connect religious and cultural leaders from around the world in support of Korean unification. In addition to spiritual and cultural unity, Moon's model also emphasized the importance of education and moral development in building a foundation for lasting peace. He believed that a unified Korea must place a strong emphasis on moral education, ethical leadership, and a commitment to social justice. This perspective was reflected in the establishment of schools, universities, and cultural institutions under the Unification Church's umbrella, which aimed to cultivate a new generation of Korean leaders who valued both national unity and global harmony. By integrating spiritual, cultural, and educational elements into his unification vision, Reverend Moon provided a comprehensive framework that sought to address not only the political and military issues of division, but also the deeper, more enduring concerns of identity, history, and shared destiny. Reverend Moon's enduring legacy and the road to Korean reunification. Reverend Sun Myung Moon's contributions to the cause of Korean unification were not limited to his efforts on the peninsula alone. They had profound global implications for peace and diplomacy in the 20th and 21st centuries. His vision of Korean unity was intertwined with a broader mission of fostering world peace, and through his leadership of the Unification Church and the Universal Peace Federation, he played a significant role in shaping the discourse on international relations and conflict resolution. This dual focus on Korean unification and global peace allowed Moon to present Korean reconciliation not as a regional issue but as a model for resolving conflicts of ideological and geopolitical origin worldwide. His efforts influenced diplomatic initiatives on multiple continents, particularly in regions where divided nations or communities sought to reconcile differences through dialogue and cultural cooperation. One of the most enduring aspects of Moon's legacy was his ability to mobilize interfaith and intercultural dialogue as a means of bridging divides. The Universal Peace Federation, which he established, became a global network for promoting peace through religious and cultural collaboration. These efforts resonated beyond the Korean issue, offering a framework for international engagement that emphasized shared moral and ethical principles.